Acts chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. And after the uproar was ceased, Paul called unto him the disciples, and embraced them, and departed for to go into Macedonia. And when he had gone over those parts, and had given them much exhortation, he came to Greece. And there abode 3 months, and when the Jews laid wait for him, as he was about to sail into Syria, he purposed to return through Macedonia. And there accompanied him into Asia Sopater of Berea, and of the Thessalonians, and Archicus, and Septicus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timotheus, and of Asia, and Tychus, and Thermopius. And these going through tarried for us at Troas. And we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and came unto them to Troas in 5 days, where we abode 7 days. And upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continued his speech until midnight. And there were many lights in the upper chamber, and there were gathered together, and there sat in a window a certain young man named Edgecliff, being fallen into a deep sleep, and as Paul was long preaching, he sunk down with sleep, and fell down from the third loft, and was taken up dead. And Paul went down and fell on him, and embracing him, said, Trouble not yourselves, for his life is in him. When he therefore was come up again, and had broken bread and eaten, and talked a long while, even till break of day, so he departed. And they brought the young man alive, and were not a little comforted. And we went before to ship, and sailed unto Assos, there intending to take in Paul, for so he had appointed, minding himself to go afoot. And when he met with us at Assos, we took him in, and came to Mylene, and we sailed thence, and came the next day over against Chios, and the next day arrived at Samos, and tarried at Tigurium, and the next day we came to Miletus. For Paul had determined to sail to Ephesus, because he would not spend, had determined to sail by Ephesus, because he would not spend the time in Asia, for he hasted, if it were possible for him, to be at Jerusalem at the day of Pentecost. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for blessing this passage. Thank you for the opportunity to consider the things it has for us. Lord, I just pray that you will consider the life of Paul and the things that he's gone through and things that he did as an example of faithful work of ministry, having run his race and being faithful in all things. Lord, I just pray that you'll help us to see this little bit, what we can learn from it. Just I pray. Amen.
Right.
All right, so we gather together with all this little stuff, and a lot of times in this passage we have here the story about Eutychus, the young man who had fallen into a deep sleep, and everybody jokes about how that people are, preachers that are long-winded and everything, and at least I'm not as long-winded as Paul, and preaching till midnight, the first of the day, and all this stuff, and then other preachers would preach about Eutychus being half in and half out, and how that we shouldn't be Christians that are on the edge, ready to fall out of Christianity, or fall in. They would be very much, a lot of sermons preached about Eutychus and the fact that he was hanging out by a window, and they make it sound like Eutychus was doing something kind of bad, not being awake and not being, and they're just dumping on Eutychus and saying, oh, he's an awful kid, he's a brat, he's falling out windows and falling asleep in church, and he's he got, if you want, and in the sermon I got basically a few things here. Food, I'm kind of titled it, in ministry you need food, faith, and fellowship. Okay, so that's the sermon. Kind of, I had a lot of F's here. So food, faith, hold on. Food, faith, fellowship, focus, friends, and funds, and all that stuff. So I had a lot of F's to mess around with. But there's some good F's in this passage. But then a lot of times you'll say, oh, Eutychus, he had some bad F's in his life. He had he fell asleep and he falls out windows. And Paul even fell upon him. So you got some F's there, and they're all the same word, falling. And so you got a sermon there. And so, there are a lot of things you can mess around with this and have fun with this, but I wanted to have the larger context and have it more focused on Paul and also on his ministry. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time messing with Eutychus. He's a good guy. He tried to stay awake. The upper chamber was really warm, and so he just got to get through the window, has a few breaths with the fresh air, and because he was working, I bet he was a hard worker, working a long day, and it just happens. He was struggling to stay awake. I think he was a good guy. It just life got the better of him, and he fell out of the window. So it was an accident, guys. Quit messing around with Eutychus. But anyway, so I'm not going to have a 3-point sermon on Eutychus and how he fell out a window and failed Christianity and failed life in general, and he just needs to get back in fellowship with the church and all this stuff. But I'm not going to mess around too much with Eutychus. After the uproar was ceased, Paul called unto him his disciples and embraced them and departed to go into Macedonia. So we see here this sermon starts out with, or this passage starts out with the fact of Acts chapter 19. In verse 21, it said, after these things were ended, Paul purposed in the Spirit when he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia to go to Jerusalem, saying, after I had been there, I must also see Rome. So the purpose of this passage is the fact that God gave him, through the Spirit, his next mission, his next focus. And so in keeping with the sermon on to his mission, in ministry, I want to let you know that we need to have focus in ministry. We need to have faith, and that faith needs to have focus. And that focus was through the Spirit. And so we see that Paul had a focus on what he had to do next in the ministry. He was doing ministry, and in Acts chapter 19, he's helping a group of disciples become a church and setting them to structure properly. And then he's going in synagogues, preaching the gospel to the Jews, and then he's teaching in another place, in a school of one Tyrannus, and he continues there preaching and teaching the word of the Lord. And God's bringing special miracles through him in town, and in Ephesians, in Ephesus. He's bringing special miracles. He's doing all these wonderful things for about 2 years. He's in ministry, and everything is going really well. There's some ups and downs. There's great ministries. People are burning their heretical Jewish documents about mysticism and the Kabbalah and all this garbage that most likely ended up getting collected in Kabbalah, and things that they had together. And these people that were Jewish, but they were all consorting. They were basically wizards and into witchcraft and all that stuff. Paul was really able to help them. And then also, of course, after they had burned all their documents, they got right with the Lord. These were Christians as well who were messed up in this witchcraft garbage. And when they saw the power of the Lord and how God mightily worked through Paul, that they not only believed on the Lord Jesus Christ, but they also got rid of all the other garbage in their life. And so Paul not only helped them get saved and convert to the New Testament, he also helped them grow spiritually. And he was doing a mighty work there because of his anointing as in his vow, and he's trying to do ministry the best he can. And as he's doing ministry the best he can, he is in the Spirit. After those things are ended, Paul purposed in the Spirit. So he's not purposing of his own self, but through his desire to do more ministry. He had a focus. He saw where he was going to go. In fact, we find that this purpose and spirit shows us the next steps in his life, and eventually going to Rome, and even eventually, as we hear from history, that he even stood before Caesar and gave the gospel. And so this verse gives focus to the rest of his ministry. He's already had 3 tours of faithful ministry and starting churches, and now he's going to finish up, because now he gets this focus. He realizes that, hey, I'm going to be going to Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem I might be killed and sent off to Rome. I know that much. And so in order to make sure that everybody knows what's going to happen, I'm going to visit everybody. I'm going to, now that I've purposed in the Spirit to do this, to eventually go to Jerusalem and to Rome, I want to make sure that everybody that I've started churches with, that I've ministered to, that I helped grow in the faith, has what they need for life and godliness from me. So that I'm not leaving them high and dry. And so that's what the purpose of this next group of travels are, because first of all, he wants to visit everybody and to kind of finish up everything. That's why you're going to see a lot of hugging, a lot of embracing, a lot of sadness, and a lot of mushiness coming forward, because he knows and they know that what awaits him in Jerusalem is bondage and eventually to Rome. And so remember, this is Acts chapter 19 verse 21 shows us also that going to Rome was not a mistake, but he knew all along that's where he would end up. And so his ministry was always one of faith and not foolishness. Oh, I'm just going to rashly demand to go to Caesar, or I'm going to rashly insult the people in Jerusalem. No, none of that happened. All of this was through faithful ministry, and he run his course faithfully. And so here in this we see focus in our faith. Focus in our faith is that he purposed in his spirit that when he passed through Macedonia and to Achaia to go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. And so that was his goal, that was his purpose, but then he's delayed a little bit with this uproar and all these things going on. And so after that's all done, he says, well, this is as good a time as any to get going. And so after the uproar was ceased, Paul called unto him disciples, and they embraced them and departed to go into Macedonia. He's going back into Macedonia. Remember, that's where Philippi is, that's where Thessalonica is, and all these different places. That the Philippi was where he cast out the demon, the lady who had the demon, and then he got stuck in jail for a while, and they started singing songs, the chains fall off, and the guard says, what must I do to be saved? He says, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved in thy house. And they start the church with the the movement of this demonic spirit and all that stuff. So it was quite an interesting time there. And so they're going back to Macedonia just to confirm those churches, just to make sure everything's going well. And they're going to meet back up with Luke and so forth in these where they left him previously. And so here he embraced them and he departed to go into Macedonia. And when he had gone to those parts, he had given them much exhortation and came to Greece. So he exhorted to them, he preached to them, he proclaimed his faith. So his focus was to exhort to them, to give them information, to tell them what they needed to do. And he did this, he got over those parts and given them much exhortation. He came to Greece, and there abode 3 months. And so he's exhorting all for 3 months in all these places in Macedonia and Greece. And so there abode 3 months, and when the Jews laid wait for him, as he was about to sail into Syria, he purposed to return through Macedonia. So now he's going to go sail back to Syria, where his home church is in Antioch of Syria. But the Jews are waiting at the dock for him, and say, just as their custom was, how are we going to kill Paul today? That's basically what their ministry is kind of like the Republicans and the Democrats. What's the Democrats' platform? Stop the president! Stop the president! I mean, it's like, do you have anything else you stand for? No, just stop the president. So it's just like in the Old Testament, they stood for the Lord, they did all these things, and then they started getting self-righteous, and they started getting arrogant, and when they were confronted with that, eventually it was just stop the Christians. So that was their platform, stop the Christians. And so that's what they're trying to do, is to stop the Christians. And here in this passage we see that he decides to change up his plans. So focus doesn't always mean that you're going to be doing, like he purposed to go onto the ship, and yet now, no, let's go travel the other way. Because focus in ministry doesn't always mean that you set course on one thing and then you don't ever turn from that. Sometimes you're going to have to deviate. Sometimes you're going to have to stop. Sometimes you're going to have to slow down or change your plans, because just because he purposes to do something does not necessarily mean that's the only way to do it. And so that's kind of, when he came from an obstacle, he found a way around it. He didn't say, oh, the Jews are there, I can't ever go back to Jerusalem. No, he says, hey, where's a different way to go to where I'm supposed to go? So we know where God wants us to go. Sometimes there'll be just different ways to get there. And so sometimes your plans will be messed up, but don't worry about it. In focus in ministry, you have focus on what you have to do, and then the goals to get there change as the situation does. And so that's what we see here as he's traveling. Travel plans change. And there accompanied him into Asia, Sophor of Berea, and of the Thessalonians, and Archicus, and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timotheus of Asia, and Tychus, and Thermomus. And these going before tarried for us at Troas. And so us there implying Luke, the writer of Acts. And so here in this passage we first have faith and focused faith, and now we have friends in the ministry. We have friends in the ministry. So the first thing you need in the ministry is focused faith. The second thing in the ministry you need is fellowship with friends. So oftentimes people try to do ministry. I'm this great man of God all by myself in the middle of nowhere, and woe is me. I'm suffering for Jesus in the middle of nowhere. And you need to have friends. You need to have not only friends, but you need to have fellowship with friends. You need to realize that the ministry is not a one-man show. It is a one-God show, but he uses many people, and even God likes to have fellowship with his creation. He has fellowship with Adam and Abraham and Paul and the apostles, and he has fellowship with people. He had fellowship with people. And so we need to understand in ministry, we need to have friends and fellowship with friends. And this is a bunch of people that says, hey, you know, there's Jews out to get him, but there's also friends there to protect him. You see, when you have friends in the ministry, there will be people that are enemies. They may look like they're in ministry. Oh, the Jews are so religious and they do all these godly things for God, but they're out to attack and destroy and to maim and to kill Paul and anybody who's doing true ministry for the Lord, because they are blinded. They are blinded by their sin and so forth, and their desire. Whatever reason they have, they're blinded by their traditions of man. And so here we have to understand that in order to do proper ministry, you need to find those people that are doing ministry and do it with them. And that's why we as Christians minister through the church. So many people say, oh, we can just, you know, God's called me to do this, that, or the other thing, and I'm going to go off by myself and do it. No, you do it in the midst. You do ministry underneath the authority of the local church, because submitting one to another, you have fellowship and friendship, and you have protection from the wicked. And that's where you can have the ability to do ministry is among friends. Even Paul the Apostle, who had the authority to do ministry and to start churches, did not do it alone, but he had people to help him. He started out with Barnabas as a helper to Barnabas, and then from Barnabas he goes on to Silas, and then from Silas he goes on to Timothy, and Timothy goes on to Gaius, and so forth. You have so many people that are helping Paul. You're helping, you get Apollos, you get basically, and also Aquila and Priscilla, and you get Luke, and you get all these other people here. And then also you're going to have, in addition to generally people, you also have, if you look at some of these names, people have speculated about some of these guys. For example, let's see here about Archicus and Secundus, or Erasticus, I should say. Erasticus means aerocrat, or the however that word is said. I'm not part of that upper echelon of society, so I don't know how to say that word, I guess. The aristocracy, the ruling class. So his name kind of implies that he's in that upper echelon, like a nickname of, hey, you know, he's the high roller. He's the guy who's up in that upper echelon. He rubs shoulders with all the rulers and things. And so in fellowship and friendship, there will be people of high estate, and then also the Secundus is a nickname, or what is commonly referred to as many people are called secondus, is basically is you are a servant in a household, and the second servant is called the secondus, and the first servant is called the primus, or something like that. Oftentimes it implies that he was. They say his name implies that he perhaps was a slave in a household. So perhaps maybe they were, like one was the master and one was the servant, and traveling together, but they both ministered to Paul as equals, as Christians. And so we see that there is in fellowship, there is often no, Paul especially, he would not discriminate against Gentile versus Jew, or autocracy versus a servant. And James himself says, remember the poor. And then Paul was like, yeah, I'm aiming to do that. And so he did not care if they were part of the 1% or the 99% or whatever status of life he wanted to give somebody. He did not care about that thing. He cared about fellowship in the faith. And so in ministry, you need to have fellowship with people that want to work with you regardless of their social standing. And so obviously you don't want to be having fellowship with people that are drunkards and wine bibbers and all these different things, to know not to eat with such people. But as far as social standing, monetarily or socially, that is not a discriminating factor. If they are in Christ, we are one together, and we have fellowship with one another. And so here in this passage we see that Paul had fellowship and friends, had friends with fellowship. And these before tarried for us at Troas, and sailed away from Philippi after those days of unleavened bread. And so also, in addition to these things, is that in these areas, this is about the time when he was collecting. I believe it says he's gone over those parts and gave them much exhortation, and came to Greece in verse 2, is that they were also during this time collecting money. You don't see this in the book of Acts, but you see in other books of Paul that he was collecting and making a collection for the saints. And so underneath the title of food, you also need funds. You got food, fuel, funds. The ministry needs food for the body and food for the ministry, which would be funds and so forth. And so not only did he have focused faith, not only did he have fellowship with friends, he had food, and one of those foods was funds from the churches for the early church, and I just want to throw that one in there. And then food for himself, to fulfill the journey. So in life, you're going to need to have. Ministry needs funds to come together and to work for the common good. You have fellowship with people that will work together, also with one another regardless of social standing, but also through their finances. What is that? Time, treasure, and so forth. Time and treasure and abilities. Time, talent, what is it? Time, talent, treasures. Yes. And so that goes along with the fellowship with friends, because friends care for each other, they look out for each other, and these churches all together saw that the church in Jerusalem needed help, and so those friends wished to send. Not only did he have friends that traveled with them, that these people, if you look at where they're from, Berea, Thessalonians, and from Derbe and so forth, these guys are like one representative from each of the churches that Paul started. If you notice, if you take a look at these guys from Derbe and different places, that not only are they collecting these funds, but each as a representative from these different areas are taking the funds with Paul to Jerusalem as representatives. Hey, this is showing that these guys say, hey, this is what Paul did for us spiritually in starting us and gathering us, telling us about Christ. And so what we're going to do is we're going to, in fellowship, take these funds, and we're going to go with Paul, keep him safe and protect him, and travel with him as traveling companions. And then we're going to be representatives to the Jerusalem church and to the church in Antioch, and we're going to tell them, hey, this is what they did, and here's the money that we collected to help out the poor saints, because they sold lands and property and all those things so that we could have the gospel. Now we are going to give them money to replace, and because they're having a great dearth that's coming to the land, and so here's some money to help them, the poor saints in Jerusalem. And so that's what they're doing. They are, as representatives, saying, hey, what investment you put into Paul is paying out. We're part of his ministry. This is what he's taught us. And so they are telling, so it's not like Paul is like secretly running off somewhere with the church's money or this representation and saying, hey, I'm actually just doing my own thing. But then when I come back to the church, I'm pretending to be some great spiritual guy writing all these letters telling people to believe them. These guys are fruit of his ministry. And so in fellowship, you take care of one another with your time, talent, and treasures, and with your reputations, with your examples and explanations, so that all comes together. So in ministry, you need to have your fruit. You need to have fellowship with your friends, your fruit, so that can go under food and fellowship, and so forth. And so he says, and he sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and came into them with Troas 5 days, where we abode 7 days. And so here we have food, unleavened bread. But no, that's his fellowship as well, because the unleavened bread is a time to gather together for the Lord's Supper, for the Passover, and for celebrating of the Lord's death. So that's the unleavened bread. And so during the time of unleavened bread, they came unto Troas in 5 days, where we abode 7 days. So they abode at Troas 7 days, and on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread. And so understand, this is, remember, the week of unleavened bread is the first week, and then that first day of the week after the week of unleavened bread is Sunday, and that is when Christ rose again. So not only is this the first day of the week of the week, it's also Resurrection Sunday. And so that's what he's doing there. They are celebrating Resurrection Sunday. They are celebrating Sunday services, and so that's what they're doing. And so basically, he comes there. He holds this with them, preached unto them, ready to depart in the morrow, and continued his speech until midnight. And so he knows he has to leave the next day, and so everybody's gathered together, and because they're not going to see him ever again, he's going to preach to them and give them information as much as he can, so that's why he's going late. It's not like it's a regular service where the pastor always goes late. And so preachers can't really use this as an excuse to go late all the time. Even as much as I would like to, Paul went till midnight, and so the evening service can go to midnight. No, I can't do that unless we're doing like special candlelight service, Resurrection Sunday, Easter Sunday, and so forth. And so basically, he's preaching late into the night because he's going to be gone to the next day, and so he's fellowshipping with them. He's breaking bread with them. And he is keeping the Lord's Supper with them. He has faith, fellowship, and food with them together. And so they continue this to midnight, and there are many lights into the upper chamber where they gathered together. And so he's explaining, hey, Eutychus didn't really do this on purpose. It's just there's a bunch of lights in there, and they've been going for several hours now. And it's Easter Sunday, and it's in the middle of it's not like in the Jewish district where they get Easter Sunday off, because Easter Sunday was a day of rest there. The day after, I think, I don't know how all that works out, so Sunday for the Greek world was a working day. Saturday the Jewish people had off and whatnot, and usually that was kind of everybody's day off. But the Sunday was a working day, so they came, had an evening service after a long day's work, and all these lights are going, and he's preaching into the night, they were gathered together, they were fellowshipping together, and there sat in a window a certain young man named Edgecliff, being fallen into a deep sleep. So first of all, you should never stop fellowshipping together. You should never fall asleep in church, and you should never. Anyway, I'm not going to. Anyway, so Paul, he was long preaching. He was long preaching. So he wasn't just going there, dear friends, I'm just so glad to be here. It's so wonderful. No, he was like exhorting them, preaching and declaring what the Lord had done for him and what they need to be doing as Christians. And he was exhorting them and preaching and so forth. And he was long preaching. And so being fallen to a deep sleep, Paul was long preaching, sunk down with sleep, and fell down from the third loft and taken up dead. And Paul went down and fell on him, and embracing him said, "Trouble not yourselves, for his life is in him." So here we have, of course, again the three falls. Had fallen into a deep sleep, and he fell down from the window, and Paul went down and fell upon him and embraced him and said, "Trouble not yourselves." So if you want to get on Eutychus, there's your 3-point outline. And therefore he was come up again and had broken bread and eaten. So he's having fellowship, he's rescuing people, saving people's lives, and then he's going back down for some more food. So he's having some more food with friends and fellowship. So therefore he was come again and had broken bread and eaten, and talked a long while, even until the break of day, and so he departed. So he left at the very last moment, because he knew he was about ready to leave. He even though he enjoyed the fellowship, even though he enjoyed the food, we need to realize that these things are subject to the focus in ministry. We need to have fellowship, and we need to have food. We need to fuel our bodies, and we need to do ministry together. But we need to make sure that the fellowship does not distract from the ministry. We need to realize that, yes, it's important to have a lot of preaching and do all these things, but we also need to realize that focus and fellowship. So oftentimes, yes, preaching is important, but sometimes they make that the biggest priority. He fell out the window, but I'm still preaching. Don't get out of your seats. So some preachers are like that. Little baby cries over here, and the preacher stops his preaching and says, "How dare you have that little baby crying in the seats? How dare you do this?" And then he just throws a fit because the preaching is so important that that they stopped, took care of business with the person, and then moved on with their preaching and teaching and whatever they needed to do. But that it wasn't so important that they ignored the guy who fell out of the window. They took care of the guy. They had fellowship with the guy. So preaching is really important, but that doesn't mean that that's the priority. In your faith, you need to have focus. You need to have priorities, and you need to have all these things, but they need to be in priority, and so forth. And so if somebody falls out a window, we got these ones aren't third floor, so they're good to go, and the other ones don't open. So you shouldn't have too much of a problem if somebody's intending to. And we got air conditioning today. So air conditioning means that you don't have an excuse. If it gets a little warm, we can turn it down. If it gets a little cold, bring a coat. And so forth. And so forth. And so all these things that we listed about Eutychus, we have no excuse here in this church. And so anyway, and so we do a lot of things to make sure that you don't preach. Like, we don't have 5-hour sermons. We have an hour sermon. Hour and a half ministries or whatever.
We heard that.
An hour and a half. So back in the day, the guys would say, "We're going to stay here until the Lord tells us to leave," and they would go on and like an hour and a half, an hour, 2-hour sermons. That's what I've heard. And so we don't go that long. We go longer than most folks here, but and so all those excuses why he fell asleep, they're no longer in the modern church. We got modern conveniences, and so no excuses there, right? Yeah, I don't hear any amens out there. Hello? Okay, I guess I won't get amens from that. But and he brought the young man alive, and they were a little comforted. And so fellowship brings comfort, and it brings revival a little bit. So if you have proper fellowship and help with one another. And so when he met with us, and so basically, and they were comforted, and he went before a ship and sailed to Assos. They're intending to take on Paul. So Paul is so long taking his time that he even misses the boat. So he says, instead of jumping on the boat with you guys and taking the long trip around, I'm going to take a shortcut through the land because there are so many things I have to tell these people that I need to stay a little bit longer. Focus ministry sometimes means changing your plans around a little bit. Sometimes, obviously focus ministry means that sometimes you have to change your plans because the enemy is after you and so forth. Other times you need to change your plans because ministry requires you to do more things than you thought you would do. Sometimes ministry, I always joked is that I always thought I'd run 100 in church the first week I started, So it doesn't, ministry doesn't work that way. I mean, no matter how much I think of myself when I look in the mirror and say, oh, you got it. Most people aren't going to think that about me. It takes long, hard work before even one or two people even decide that they want to spend time even listening to my voice. I don't have the best voice. I'm not the most charismatic person. And so my charisma is not going to build this church. It's just not going to do it. But having focus in ministry just means that you need to realize the situations you are in, realize that sometimes people are going to need a little bit more ministry, and so he's going to kind of miss the boat here, miss an opportunity there, miss a certain thing there, just so that we can make sure that these people get just a little bit more that they need. And so instead of taking the boat with everybody else, he stays and delays and then goes on afoot, minding himself to go afoot. So he's communicating with these people, and at the last moment runs to meet his ship. When he met with us at Assos, he then took him and came to Mylene. And so here we see that again his focus in ministry requires that he continues on. Sometimes in ministry, that even if you don't want to go, even if you want to continue on a certain path of ministry, sometimes the boat requires that you go a different direction. Sometimes the focus requires, sometimes you have a certain timetable you have to stick by, because even though he didn't want to leave, the boat isn't going to stop for you, and you have to, even though you can make a shortcut here, the boat isn't going to stop for you, and eventually you're going to have to get on that boat because that's where the focus and the ministry is taking you. And so you see all these lists of places he's going, and day over against Chios, and the next day we arrived at Samos and tarried at Turigulum, and the next day came to Miletus. And so he's ending up at Miletus, and so he's doing a lot of traveling because he has this focus in ministry, and so there's only a certain amount of time that he can stay in each place. For he had determined to sail by Ephesus. Ephesus is where he started out at the beginning of the chapter, and he's going all over 4 months in the region of Macedonia and Achaia, and then he is finally done on his trips, and then he says, hey, I've run out of time. I can't get back to Ephesus because I need to be in Jerusalem at a certain time. And so in the next passage we're going to see where he calls, because he can't stay there, because his focus in ministry is so important that he can't make a special trip to Ephesus because he knows that if he stays there, he's not going to want to leave or something like that. And so he says, instead of me going there, I'm going to be here ministering to these people in this town in Miletus. And so I want you guys to send letters and notes and stuff to Ephesus and have the elders of those churches come over here so that I can make sure that everybody, and he basically calls a church conference there, so that he can have a final ministry to them. And then the next week's sermon, we are going to look at how that what he preaches to the Ephesus elders. He says, for Paul had determined to sail by Ephesus because he would not spend the time in Asia, for he hasted, if it were possible for him, to be at Jerusalem the day of Pentecost. And so in this passage we see that the focus in ministry of Acts chapter 19 verse 21 is in full force because he wants to try to finish all this fellowship so that he can be at Pentecost. And so he just finished having Easter Sunday with them here at the Resurrection Sunday, and then he is now going to, and Pentecost is 50 days later, and so that kind of gives you the time frame of how fast he has to get this stuff done, is that he wants to be in Jerusalem for Pentecost. Why? Because he has a vow on himself, and he needs to finish that vow at the temple in Jerusalem, and we're going to see that later on in the next chapters. But here in this passage, we see that focus in ministry required that other people sometimes have to do sacrifice as well. Sometimes you won't be able to do everything. You can't finish everything. And the focus in ministry implies that that those people that are doing ministry with you, you have to work together. You have to make sure that, hey, if somebody is inconvenienced, you try to help them out. If somebody has a message that you know is important, somebody has to do something that is important. You see, if I know, that's why the church here, we try to, if somebody has a call of God on their life to do a certain ministry, if they come to join this church, we as a church try to help them out in that ministry because they're called of God to do it. If the pastor has a ministry that is burdened to do, and he has a focus for the church together submitting one to another, says, hey, the pastor wants this as our church ministry, let's try to do that ministry if we can. It doesn't always mean that you're going to be able to do it. Sometimes God has called you to a different direction or something, but by and large, if the pastor has a vision for the church, that's what everybody in the church should focus on getting to. And so here in this passage, we see that sometimes focus in ministry means that you're not going to be able to do all those things that you can, but then other times you can if people cooperate and help you. And so in this process, we see here in this passage that Paul's ministry had a focused faith. It had a purpose to it. Sometimes people have church with no focus, no purpose. They're doing things for the Lord, they say, but they don't do it together. Their focus is gone. And so here in this passage we see that Paul had a focus. He had a purpose in the Spirit. And so we all together, submitting one to another, must have a purpose in the Spirit. What's the purpose of our church? And let's get on board with that. And what are the areas in which our pastor cannot do things that we can step up and say, hey, I can do that? Where are the areas where like for example, maybe a member can't do something, but hey, pastor knows exactly how to do that. Let's get him on board. Where are those things where we say, hey, I would like to learn how to do a certain ministry or a certain thing. Let me have some fellowship with the pastor, have some food or something, and let's get together and talk about this and exhort one another and to do these things. Because focused, purposeful ministry needs to have focused faith. It needs to have fellowship. It needs to have friends. You can't do these things alone. You need to do these things together. And when you are doing ministry, you need to have fuel to do it. Because if you don't have any of those things, you're going to fall asleep spiritually. The preaching's going to seem long to you if you have no focus, and you're going to be falling asleep as if it were dead, because James says, of course, that faith without works is dead. And when you are suffering long and without purpose, just sitting in the windowsill, you are going to be as if dead. But you need to have the Spirit to fall upon you to give you a purpose. And so there, I tied it in with Eutychus for all those people who want to bash on Eutychus. So in all of this, we need to understand that together we can do the ministry that God has purposed in the Spirit for us to do. And we're going to see, of course, next week we're going to look at that message that the final message Paul gives to the Ephesian elders, and that'll be quite good. But the takeaway from this and Eutychus' name is Lucky. If you want to know, his English name is Lucky, or good fortune. And the fact is that we're all a Eutychus when we start out our Christian life. We just need to get these purposes of Paul. We need to be, because when we have a purpose, even the long preaching of Paul, even the long things that kind of make us fall asleep and fall out windows and have the pastor fall upon us. Wake up back there! So these things that seem hard in life to stay awake with, if we have purpose and focus, the preaching suddenly becomes, information that I can use for my ministry. And then the food is like, oh man, I'm hungry, I need to get something so I can do ministry. And then the fellowship is like, I got great friends so that I can do ministry. But if you don't have a focused ministry, then you're going to be like Eutychus and fall out windows. So let's go ahead and pray and not fall out any windows. We'll keep them locked, keep the air conditioner nice and good temperature, and not try to go too long in preaching until you get that focus and purpose of ministry, I guess. So, all right, let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you, blessing to give it to us, Lord. I just pray that you'll continue to guide and help us and do your will, and to have a purpose in our ministry, have a purpose in our church, to do your will, to do your works, and to live Christ and be the example for the people we minister. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.